My name is Clara Monroe. I was just 19 when I watched my father and his new wife sit smugly in a lawyer's office, expecting to inherit everything my mother had built. But when the will was read and the estate was left entirely to me, their masks cracked, and I realized I wasn't grieving a mother. I was preparing for war. Before we get into it, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. They say funerals bring out the worst in people, but no one prepares you for the paperwork, the cold aftermath where grief becomes numbers, deeds, balances, and trust becomes a currency no one can afford. I sat in the conference room of Lafferty and Moore, one of the oldest and most prestigious law firms in New Orleans, feeling like I'd wandered into a museum of mahogany and whispered secrets. The scent of aged paper and polished wood clung to the air. And across from me, in seats far too comfortable for people so cruel, sat my father Richard Monroe and Marlene, his new wife, 5-inch heels, blood-red lipstick, and a face that hadn't flinched once during the funeral. I was still in my black dress, still smelled like roses and rain. My hands clenched around the edge of the chair, trying not to shake as Mr. Forrester, the family attorney, cleared his throat. Per the last will and testament of Margaret Monroe, he began, sliding the manila envelope open like it was sacred. The entirety of her personal estate, including the Garden District home, savings accounts, and proceeds from the bookstore sale, are to be held in trust for her daughter Clara Monroe until she reaches the age of 25. There was a beat of silence, sharp, still, surgical. Marlene gasped. Richard, my father, made a sound between a scoff and a growl. His face turned the shade of overripe plum. "Excuse me," Marlene's voice cracked the air. "That can't be right." Mr. Forrester adjusted his glasses. "It's quite clear. Margaret left specific instructions. Clara is the sole beneficiary with provisions for her education, housing, and—" "This is ridiculous," Richard snapped, standing so suddenly his chair squealed across the hardwood. "Margaret would never shut me out of her estate. I was her husband. You were her burden, I thought." But I didn't speak. Not yet. Marlene leaned forward like a woman who'd mistaken her reflection for power. "There must be an error, a typo, something. Margaret was unstable toward the end. My mother ran a bookstore for 2 decades. She balanced budgets, read 4 languages, and stayed up every night editing my college applications. She wasn't unstable. She just finally stopped trusting the man who'd abandoned her when the cancer got bad. Mr. Forrester didn't flinch. There's a video statement if you'd like to view it." Richard sat back down hard. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt it, the heat of betrayal twisted into something meaner. He wasn't just furious, he was humiliated. This wasn't about money, it was about control. "This must be illegal," Marlene muttered, rifling through her purse like she could pull out a legal loophole and slap it on the table. I finally found my voice. "My mother made a choice." Both of them turned to me. "Maybe you thought she'd forget, but she remembered everything. Every check you never wrote, every trip you took while we rationed groceries, every time you said you needed to find yourself while she found a way to keep our lights on." Marlene looked like she'd bitten a lemon. Richard just stared, and for the first time I didn't shrink under it. I stood, slowly smoothing my dress, my heart a jackhammer in my chest. "I'll review the documents. Thank you, Mr. Forrester." He nodded. "Take your time, Clara. And your mother was very clear. She wanted you to have choices. She said she owed you that much." As I stepped out of the office, I could feel their eyes burning into my back, but I didn't look back, because that day I realized something chilling. They didn't come to mourn, they came to collect, and they left empty-handed. The Garden District in New Orleans is known for its charm, grand porches, wrought iron gates, trees that whisper old secrets when the wind passes through. But that day, as I stepped up the familiar path to my childhood home, the brick walkway felt heavier beneath my feet, like every memory had gathered to watch me return alone. The key stuck a little in the lock. My mother always meant to fix that. I hesitated, then turned it, stepping into the hush of dust and shadows. The scent hit me first. Lavender and lemon balm, the same blend she used in every load of laundry. I almost expected her to call out from the kitchen, "Clara, I made your favorite tea." But the house stayed silent. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, heart thudding. The air was thick with mourning, but not just for her. I was mourning the version of myself that still believed family meant safety. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, catching dust in its glow. The living room was exactly as she'd left it, books stacked like architectural features, crocheted pillows with fraying edges, and a framed photo of the two of us on the mantel. I walked to it slowly, picking it up. She had that tired smile on, one she wore for most of my high school years. The one that said, "I'm doing my best, baby, even if it's barely enough." I wandered through the house like a ghost, retracing her own footsteps. The walls were lined with years of life, postcards from authors she admired, handmade bookmarks from the bookstore's opening weekend, newspaper clippings about local literary festivals. In her bedroom, everything was neat. Her dresser still held the lavender sachets she made every spring. I pulled open a drawer, running my fingers over the folded scarves, a slip of a letter peeking out from underneath. It was one of her letters to me. She used to write them when she didn't have time to talk, little bits of wisdom wrapped in ink and paper. "Clara, trust yourself. Even when they call you ungrateful, difficult, or cold, trust the part of you that knows what's fair. I didn't always stand up for us the way I should have. But you can." I sat on the bed, the letter pressed to my chest, and let the silence wrap around me. She had known. She hadn't just written a will. She had written a warning. Downstairs, the sun had begun to shift, and the kitchen glowed amber gold like it always did around 5 p.m. I opened the pantry and found the old tin where she kept her favorite tea blends, still half full. I filled the kettle. As it heated, I noticed something strange. The calendar on the fridge. The last day she marked was 2 weeks before she died. Next to it, in her neat handwriting, was a note. "Call Delaney, confirm transfer." Delaney was her accountant. I made a mental note. The kettle hissed. As I poured the water, footsteps echoed on the porch. A knock followed. I froze. Then I heard Marlene's voice through the door. Sweet. Too sweet. "Clara, honey, we brought dinner. Thought you might need some company." I didn't answer. I backed away from the door, cup trembling in my hand. Richard's voice joined hers. "We just want to talk. That lawyer made a mess, but we can figure this out, like a family." Like a family? I set the cup down quietly, heart pounding. They were still out there, trying to charm their way back into a future my mother had already locked them out of. I stepped into the hallway and waited. The knocking eventually stopped. Their footsteps faded, but I knew they'd be back. This house wasn't just mine now, it was ground zero, and I had no choice but to defend it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds tapping at the kitchen window, nature's version of an alarm clock. I'd barely slept. Between the letter I found and the ghost of last night's visit, my brain had run a marathon in the dark. I kept hearing Marlene's voice in my head, sticky sweet and unsettling. Like a family. I padded barefoot into the kitchen, my old flannel robe wrapped tight around me. The tile was cold underfoot, the way it had always been, but the warmth that used to live in this room, the comfort of cinnamon in the mornings, the soft clatter of teacups, felt replaced by a kind of hum. The kind that comes before a storm. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when the front door creaked open. "Clara," my father called, like this was still his house. Like we hadn't sat in that law office 2 days ago where he'd practically turned purple over my mother's will. I turned slowly. Marlene was with him, her perfume arriving a full 2 seconds before she did. "Oh good, you're up," she chirped, dropping her purse on the kitchen island like it belonged there. She wore a coral cardigan, too bright for morning, and brought a covered tray that smelled of buttery pastry. "I made quiche, goat cheese and spinach. You must be starving. Grief eats through people." I just stared. Richard, ever the actor, grabbed 2 mugs from the cabinet like he still remembered where everything was. "Thought we'd share breakfast. You've been through a lot." I said nothing. Just watched as he poured himself coffee using the mug with "Best Dad" written on it in cracked gold lettering. A relic from a kindergarten Father's Day project I now regretted. He sat across from me, sipping with a calm that made my spine tense. "Clara," Marlene began gently, settling onto a bar stool. "We were thinking you're in a fortunate position now, and things have been a little tight for us lately. Just until we get caught up, maybe you could help out with a few bills." I blinked. "Bills?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. Richard nodded, not looking at me. "Water heaters shot, electrics do, grown-up stuff." Marlene laughed lightly. Now that you're flush, we figured it might be easier for you. Flush. It hit me then, not just what they were doing, but how. This wasn't a request. It was a setup, a test. They weren't trying to rebuild a bridge. They were testing whether I'd give away the bricks. I'll think about it, I said slowly, and their faces lit up like I'd already handed them a blank check. Of course, sweetheart, Marlene said, reaching to squeeze my hand. No pressure, we're just so proud of how mature you've been. Mature, right. I nodded, smiling tightly as I stood to rinse my mug. And in that moment, I realized something else. The kitchen, my mother's domain, felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in while I wasn't looking. The windows watched. The cabinets remembered. Richard looked around as he sipped. You know, this place could use a remodel. Open concept would really modernize it. I turned back. I like it this way, I said. Marlene glanced at Richard, then back at me. Of course, just a thought. They stayed another 20 minutes, eating, chatting, making themselves at home, and every second I could feel it, the subtle tug of invisible strings they were trying to tie to me. But they didn't know I'd already started snipping them, one by one. When they finally left, I didn't touch the quiche. I dumped it straight in the trash. And then I did what my mother taught me to do when something didn't feel right. I pulled out a notebook and started documenting everything. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and embossed with a logo I didn't recognize. It arrived 3 days after the breakfast ambush, tucked into a stack of junk mail like it was just another coupon. But the return address caught my eye, Elliott Graham and Associates, and beneath it in fine print, Certified Financial Advisory. I stared at it for a long minute before carefully sliding my finger under the flap. Inside was a short letter printed on crisp stationery and signed in blue ink. The name at the bottom stopped me cold. Elliott Graham, CPA, Margaret Monroe's accountant since 2001. My mother's accountant. I read the letter twice, then a third time. And the world, which had been tilting ever since her funeral, suddenly found its balance. There was a separate savings account, not just some emergency stash or leftover checking float, but a deliberately established, long-term education fund created when I turned 10. The funds had come from the bookstore sale 2 years ago, money I thought had vanished during her treatment costs. But it hadn't. She had sold the bookstore and tucked the profits away under my name, quietly, steadily, with instructions that they were to be used only for my tuition, housing, and professional development. Nothing else. I sat down hard on the couch, the letter trembling in my hands. She hadn't just protected me with a will. She had built an escape hatch, brick by brick, and waited until I was old enough to understand how to use it. I took the elevator downtown the next morning, clutching the letter like a talisman. The office of Elliott Graham was glass-walled, cold-toned, and smelled like fresh printer ink and polished ambition. His assistant, a young man in a gray blazer, greeted me warmly. Miss Monroe, Mr. Graham is expecting you. Elliott was an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet voice. The kind of voice that made you want to lean in. He offered me tea, which I declined, and walked me through the documents. This account was never merged with your mother's estate, he explained. She was adamant her instructions were, well, unusually specific. He handed me the paperwork, official, notarized, irrefutable. It was all in my name. She said you'd need to know that not everything would be as it seemed after her passing, he added gently. That some people might try to convince you otherwise. I swallowed. She knew my father would try something. She didn't name names, but yes. The account wasn't astronomical, but it was substantial. Enough to pay for college, grad school, a modest apartment, independence. I didn't realize I'd started crying until Elliott handed me a tissue. She believed in you, he said simply. When I left the office, I didn't go home right away. I went to the river. I stood at the edge, the Mississippi curling brown and wide around the city, and let the wind slap the salt off my cheeks. Tourists strolled by, laughing, unknowing. And I stood there, heart pounding, with one thought anchoring me. They lied, they minimized. But she knew. She knew, and she trusted me to find my way. By the time I returned to the Garden District house, my boots dusty and my pulse steady, I knew what I had to do. I pulled out the banker's documents, placed them beside my mother's letter, and waited. Because next time Richard or Marlene brought up helping with bills, I would be ready. They weren't just trying to guilt me anymore. They were trying to steal from a ghost. And I'd learned how to speak in ghost's language, quiet, firm, undeniable. Dinner smelled too good. That was my first warning. The house hadn't smelled like pot roast since before my mother got sick. She used to cook it low and slow, humming along to Norah Jones, sometimes with flour on her cheek and notes on the fridge about what still needed doing. Now it felt staged. Too perfect. Too intentional. As I stepped into the dining room, I saw Marlene lighting the last candle at the table. Real cloth napkins, my mother's holiday china, even a small vase of daisies, my favorite, not hers. "Look who finally made it," she said, beaming like this was a Hallmark movie. Richard sat at the head of the table like a throne, a bottle of red wine half emptied beside him. He didn't smile, but he didn't glare either. Not yet. "Dinner's hot," Marlene said, gesturing for me to sit. "We thought it would be nice to have a proper meal. It's been a tense couple of weeks." Tense. That's how she described a funeral, a contested will, and several veiled guilt trips about sharing the burden. I sat down slowly. "You cooked." "Of course," she said. "Thought you could use some comfort food." Comfort. Nothing about the table felt comforting. It felt like a trap laid with porcelain and passive aggression. We passed dishes in silence for a few minutes. I focused on the roast, perfectly tender, annoyingly so, and mashed potatoes so smooth they could have been piped from a bag. Marlene poured me a generous glass of wine, even though I didn't ask. Then it started. "So," she began lightly, "Richard and I have been thinking about the house. You know, long-term upkeep. There's a lot to consider." "Like," I said, not looking up from my plate. "Well, the basement's practically prehistoric," she said with a little laugh. "I don't know how Margaret managed all these years." I bristled. She said my mother's name like it tasted sour. "She managed just fine," I said flatly. Richard cleared his throat. "We had a contractor come by." "You did what?" I looked up. "Just an estimate," he said quickly. "For the pipes and maybe central air, you've got to modernize to keep value up." I set my fork down. "I didn't approve a contractor." Marlene stepped in, voice silky. "No one's doing anything without you. We just figured it might be smart to act now. And we'd cover the payments, mostly." I waited. "There's just a little snag," she continued. "To finalize the loan, they need a cosigner, purely procedural." There it was. I stared at her. "You want me to co-sign a loan," I repeated. "On my house, using my account." Richard exhaled. "Clara, don't make this harder than it needs to be. This isn't about money, it's about family." I stared at the flickering candle between us. My mother loved candlelight, said it softened everything. I wasn't interested in soft anymore. "No," Marlene blinked. "Sorry. I'm not co-signing anything," I said. My voice didn't waver. Richard sat back, mouth tightening. "Clara, be reasonable." I'm protecting my assets. That's what you taught me, remember, or tried to." He leaned forward, jaw flexing. "You're being dramatic." I smiled, tight and sharp. "So were you, in the will reading." The table went silent. Marlene set down her wine with a gentle clink. "We're just trying to keep the house in good shape, honey." "Then you can pay for it." She tried again, softer this time. "You have the means." "And I have boundaries." Richard stood. His napkin hit the table like a thrown gauntlet. "So this is how it's going to be. You hoard everything your mother left and leave us out in the cold." "No one's out in the cold," I said. "You're just not in control." He stared at me, then turned and walked out of the room. Marlene stayed seated, her face carefully blank. "I used to hope you'd come around," she said quietly. "But you're more like your mother than I thought." I met her gaze. "Thanks." And I meant it. She stood, gathered her things, and followed my father. I sat alone for a while, the food growing cold, the candles burning low. Then I cleared the table, one dish at a time, and washed the plates in silence. By the time I climbed the stairs to my room, I had written down every word of that conversation in my notebook. Date, time, tone. Because this wasn't a family dinner. It was a documented attempt at financial entrapment. By the time the morning sun began filtering through the lace curtains of my bedroom, I already knew where I was going. My fingers hovered over my phone screen for a long moment before pressing call. When she picked up on the second ring, her voice was soft but clear, like someone who'd been expecting to hear from me for a long time. "Clara," she said. "I've been waiting." Vivian wasn't the kind of aunt who sent birthday cards or knitted Christmas sweaters. She was my mother's older sister, the kind who showed up at hospitals with thermoses of soup, and always seemed to know things no one else did. When Mom got sick, Vivian had stayed for a few weeks, sleeping on the couch and talking in low voices behind closed doors. After that, we'd only kept in touch through the occasional voicemail or short note tucked into condolence cards. But now, I needed answers. She lived just outside the city, in a pale blue cottage tucked behind a creaky iron gate. The porch sagged a little under the weight of too many plants, and wind chimes danced in the breeze as I approached. "Come in, baby," she said before I even knocked. Inside, the air smelled like mint tea and dust. We sat on her wide porch with chipped teacups, the cicadas singing like a warning between us. I didn't waste time. "I need to know what my mother didn't tell me." Vivian stirred her tea slowly. "She told you more than you think, just not with words." "She left everything to me," I said. "And they're already circling my father, Marlene. They want loans, co-signatures. They talk like they own the place." Vivian nodded. "Because they were used to Margaret sacrificing. She made it easy for them to pretend she didn't matter." I bit my lip. "Why did she stay with him for so long?" Vivian looked out at the street. "Because she hoped he'd wake up one day and realize she was worth more than a placeholder. That never happened. When he left for business retreats and yoga communes, she stayed to keep things together for you." That tracked. My childhood was full of unanswered calls and my mother tucking me in alone. "I found a letter she wrote me," I said softly. "She warned me not to let them call me ungrateful just because I set boundaries." Vivian smiled sadly. "That sounds like her." I leaned forward. "Did you know about the savings account?" "She told me she was planning something for you. Said it had to be done quietly. She didn't trust Richard." That name still burned. "I found the account," I said. "Separate from the estate, enough to cover school, housing, everything. He called it irrelevant paperwork." Vivian's eyes narrowed. Typical, that man always twisted truth into convenience. I hesitated. Did he ever do anything like this before, try to take things that weren't his? Vivian looked down at her tea, silent for a long time. Then she said it. "When our father died, Richard tried to forge a signature on the inheritance documents." My breath caught. "What?" "He was just 21, she said. "Thought he could get ahead by jumping the line, tried to transfer land that wasn't his. We caught it before it finalized, but it nearly tore the family apart." "Did my mother know?" "She did, and she forgave him because that's who she was." I sat back, the porch suddenly too small, the air too thick. This wasn't just about grief or confusion. My father had a history of deception, financial, legal, strategic, and now he had Marlene, a polished partner in performance. "I think they're planning something," I said. "He's talking about meeting a different lawyer, wants me to come, says it's just to clarify the will." Vivian's eyes flashed. "Don't sign anything, not even a receipt, and whatever lawyer they take you to, assume he's in their pocket." I nodded slowly. "What do I do?" "You prepare," she said, setting down her tea. "Keep every document. Make copies. Record conversations if you can. And Clara, don't let them isolate you. That's how men like Richard win." I left her house that afternoon with a folder of old photos, a copy of my grandfather's will, and a shaking certainty in my bones. My bedroom back home became a war room. I laid out my mother's documents, Vivian's warnings, and everything I'd gathered so far. I bought a locked filing box, started color-coding my evidence. I even opened a new bank account to move the tuition funds, far from the reach of anyone with a shared last name. They thought I'd be sentimental. They didn't count on me being strategic. They were playing a game I hadn't realized I'd been born into. But now I knew the rules. I didn't say yes immediately. When Richard brought up the new lawyer, again, 2 days after my visit to Aunt Vivian, I just nodded slowly and said I'd think about it. His tone had been casual, too casual, as if asking me to grab coffee, not sit down with someone who could rewrite my financial future. But I knew what he was doing. Aunt Vivian was right. This wasn't about clarity. It was about control, so I agreed, quietly, calmly, and then I prepared. I spent that night printing every relevant document I could find, my mother's original will, the savings account paperwork, the CPA letter, even the note she left me in her drawer. I scanned it all and saved backups to an encrypted USB and a cloud folder only I could access. Then I packed a slim folder to bring with me. Not everything, just enough to remind them I wasn't walking in blind. I didn't tell them that Aunt Vivian had already put me in touch with one of her friends, a retired paralegal who now consulted on inheritance fraud cases. We hadn't hired him yet, but we might. When the day came, Marlene picked me up. She arrived 10 minutes early in a navy SUV, all bright eyes and forced friendliness. She wore a blouse with little cranes printed on it and sprayed something citrusy on her wrists that made the whole car feel like a lemon-scented interrogation chamber. "Thanks for agreeing to this," she said as we pulled onto St. Charles Avenue. "It's just easier to have everything clear and clean, you know? Clear and clean. Like they hadn't been muddying everything since the moment the will was read." I didn't answer. Just stared out the window as the city slid past. Streetcars rattling by, tourists sweating through Ghost Tour, and kids tossing beads left over from Mardi Gras into the oak trees. We pulled up to a tall gray building downtown, polished glass reflecting the stormy sky. The law office was on the 9th floor. Mr. Gaines, smooth, silver-haired, expensive cufflinks, met us in a room that smelled like printer ink and polished leather. "Clara, it's so nice to meet you," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that lasted 1 second too long. "Your parents have told me such wonderful things about you." I didn't correct him. I didn't smile either. We sat. The conference room was designed to impress: marble table, skyline view, a carafe of water with lemon slices floating inside like drowned promises. He started slow, kind, asked if I'd like anything to drink, made a show of flipping through papers I knew he'd already read. Then he slid a thin stack across the table. "Just a small clarification agreement," he said smoothly. "Sometimes wills can be misinterpreted, especially when emotions are high. This just streamlines your rights, defines responsibilities, that sort of thing." I didn't touch it. Richard was pretending to check his watch. Marlene leaned forward just enough to look invested, not desperate. I looked at the first page, legalese. Paragraphs about administrative simplification, allocation options, and co-signatory waivers. Nothing jumped out, but that was the trick, wasn't it? The poison always hid behind pretty words. "Mind if I read this thoroughly before signing anything?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Of course," Mr. Gaines said. "Take your time." But I saw the flicker in Richard's eye, the twitch in his jaw. He thought I would sign today. He needed me to. I flipped the page, then another. The language was vague. Too vague. One clause referenced a real property asset reassignment under joint fiduciary oversight. Another talked about an optional executor adjustment. "Who drafted this?" I asked quietly. "I did," Mr. Gaines said. "It's very standard." My fingers tingled. I closed the folder. "I'm going to have this reviewed," I said, sliding it back across the table. "By someone I trust." Richard exhaled loudly. "Clara, come on, we're trying to help you." "Are you?" I asked, finally looking at him. "Because this feels a lot like pressure, and pressure isn't protection." Marlene opened her mouth to say something, but Mr. Gaines held up a hand. "Of course, it's wise to be cautious." "Good," I said, standing. "Because I am." I walked out without another word, down the hallway into the elevator and out into the thick New Orleans heat. But as I reached the street, my pulse still racing, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from Aunt Vivian. I tapped play. Her voice was low, urgent. "Clara, I don't know what just happened, but I got a call. Someone's poking around at the county registrar's office asking about the title transfer for your mother's house. You need to check your documents. Something's not right." My knees went weak. They weren't just hoping I'd sign away my future. They were already trying to steal it. The hallway outside Mr. Gaines' office stretched too long, the fluorescent lights humming like a warning I hadn't heard soon enough. I didn't wait for the elevator. I walked fast until I found the restroom. The kind with heavy wood-paneled doors and gold fixtures meant to impress clients. I pushed into the farthest stall, locked it, and slumped onto the toilet seat, folder clutched tight in my arms. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I reached into my bag, pulled out the clarification agreement, and unfolded it again. County registrar. Title transfer. Vivian's voice echoed in my head like a cracked record. "They're already moving pieces." I flipped to the final page of the document and felt my stomach twist. There was a signature, my signature, but I hadn't signed anything. It wasn't even a convincing forgery. It looked like something copied from my high school yearbook, all curves and confidence I didn't feel anymore. They had faked my signature. I choked down the rush of bile crawling up my throat and grabbed my phone. No signal. Of course. I rose, pushed open the stall door slowly, and leaned into the mirror, my reflection looking back pale and glassy-eyed. I splashed water on my face, dried it with a towel so soft it felt like a bribe, and paced. Think. Vivian said they'd asked about the title, which meant they had already taken steps to transfer the deed with forged documents. I dug into my bag again and found the small leather notebook where I'd been keeping my notes. Dates. Names. What was said. What wasn't. I opened to the back and scribbled one more line. Document signed without consent. Signature pre-forged. Do not return to Gaines' office without representation. A soft noise outside the restroom door made me freeze. Footsteps, not fast, not panicked, deliberate. I pressed my ear to the stall wall, heart pounding. A voice murmured something too soft to make out. Then silence. I waited, counted to 30, then slowly pushed the stall open and stepped out. The bathroom was empty, but the door hadn't closed all the way. I nudged it open and peeked into the hallway. Empty, but something had shifted. The air felt charged, like a wire had been stripped and left humming just beneath the surface. When I returned to the main lobby, Mr. Gaines' office door was closed. Richard and Marlene were gone. I didn't ask where. I didn't wait. I walked straight out of the building, down the block, past the same coffee shop where Marlene had once promised to be the mother I never had, and didn't stop until I was back at my car, slamming the door behind me like it could shut out everything that had just happened. Inside, I let my head fall against the steering wheel. They weren't just nudging anymore. They were forging, filing, faking, and I just walked into their den without armor. My phone buzzed, signal back. 2 missed calls from Aunt Vivian and a voicemail marked urgent. I didn't play it yet. I just drove home, hands locked on the wheel, the city blurring past in shades of betrayal and unfinished business. Because now it was clear, I was already part of their scheme. The only question left was, how deep had they gone? I barely remembered driving home. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long, syrupy shadows through the garden district as I parked and stepped onto the brick path leading to the house. My house, my mother's house. For now, every leaf overhead felt like it was watching me. Inside, I locked the door behind me and dropped my bag on the hallway table. I could still smell the roast from earlier in the week, clinging faintly to the curtains. My stomach turned. I didn't head to my room, not right away. Instead, I stood in the middle of the foyer, unsure what to do next. My phone buzzed again. Another missed call from Vivian. I'd already listened to the voicemail on the drive over. Clara, if they filed something with your name, get proof. Do not confront them yet, just get proof. So I waited, because something told me they'd be back, and I didn't have to wait long. By the time the sun dipped behind the magnolias out front, I heard the gate creak, then the scrape of the key in the lock. Richard and Marlene walked in like they still owned the place. "Oh, hey," Marlene called casually, brushing wind from her hair. "We didn't think you'd be back so soon." I stayed quiet, watching from the hallway. Richard placed a bottle of wine on the kitchen counter, talking over his shoulder like we were roommates, not opposing forces. "Meeting went well, huh? Mr. Gaines is solid. You'll see, this is gonna make everything simpler." Simpler. There was that word again. They acted like the forged signature didn't exist. Like the warning in Vivian's voice hadn't just turned my blood cold. "We'll just heat up leftovers," Marlene said, as if nothing had snapped between us. "You want some?" I shook my head. "I'm tired, gonna head up." She smiled too quickly. "Of course, rest up, sweetie." I climbed the stairs without looking back, each creak beneath my foot a slow countdown in my chest. But I didn't go to my room, not yet. Once I was at the top, I waited, listened, counted the beats of silence below. Then I crept back down, socks muffling each step. I stopped just short of the kitchen archway, where the light glowed dimly and their voices had dropped to a low hum. "Marlene, she's stalling." "Richard, she's scared, that's good. She won't push back if she thinks it's already done." "Marlene, what if she brings in a lawyer?" "Richard, she won't. She doesn't have the spine. She still wants to believe this is salvageable." Marlene snorted. "You better hope so, because if she finds out the title paperwork already hit the system." Silence, then a soft clink of glass. "Richard, we'll be long gone before then." Something sharp twisted in my chest. They didn't just forge a signature, they'd filed it. They were betting I'd be too emotional, too slow, too trusting. I backed away, quiet as breath, up the stairs, into my room, locked the door, sat on the floor, folder open in my lap, and breath through the spiral rising in my throat. They weren't waiting for permission. They were betting on my hesitation. But they forgot one thing my mother taught me: to trust my instincts. And right now, every instinct was screaming that I wasn't just dealing with manipulation. This was theft, dressed up in family ties, and I was done being polite about it. The next morning, the sky cracked open without warning. Rain pounded the streets in waves, streaking the windows like smudged ink. I sat on the edge of my bed, folder still on my lap, the forged document now marked with sticky notes and highlighter ink like scars from a war I hadn't chosen. They thought I was bluffing. They thought fear would make me freeze. But what they didn't know was that silence doesn't equal surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. I dressed in all black, buttoned shirt, slacks, boots, not to intimidate, just to armor myself. I pulled my hair into a tight bun, grabbed the folder, and drove back to the law office. The same one from yesterday, same marble lobby, same lemony air, same front desk receptionist who blinked in mild surprise when she saw me. "I don't have you on Mr. Gaines' schedule," she said politely. I gave her a tight smile. "That's okay, he'll want to see me." Before she could call back, a voice carried down the hallway, not loud, but firm, footsteps, then stillness. Then Mr. Gaines himself appeared, adjusting his cufflinks as though this were a completely normal Thursday morning. "Miss Monroe," he said, voice warm. "Back so soon?" I didn't smile. "I have a few questions." He gestured toward the conference room. "Of course." But as we walked toward the same sterile space with the skyline view, something changed. Voices. Not loud, but urgent. I slowed near his office door, slightly ajar. Inside, Richard stood near the desk, hands up in that rehearsed, I'm calm way that always meant he was anything but. Marlene sat rigidly in a leather chair, her mascara already slightly smudged. And across from them, standing with arms folded and badge glinting faintly at her hip, was a woman in a navy windbreaker. FBI. I froze. So did Mr. Gaines. She turned slowly toward us. "Mr. Gaines," she said, "we were just about to request your cooperation. Would you like to step in here for a moment?" His smile faltered. Richard turned toward me. His eyes flashed surprise, panic, calculation all at once. Marlene started to speak, but the agent raised a hand. "We're going to ask that you remain silent unless addressed. This is now an active investigation." I stepped back from the door, heart hammering. "What is this?" I said, my voice more steady than I expected. The agent turned to me fully now. "You must be Clara Monroe." I nodded, numb. "We've been monitoring suspicious activity tied to a forged signature filed with the registrar's office," she said. "Your Aunt Vivian filed a whistleblower report last week. We believe your signature was used illegally on property transfer documents connected to an ongoing fraud scheme." I opened my folder slowly, holding out the forged contract with my fake signature. "I didn't sign this," I said. The agent took it with gloved hands. "We know." Behind her, Richard slumped slightly. Marlene reached for his arm. He didn't look at her. The room, cold, sleek, impersonal just moments ago, felt suddenly heavy, electric, like justice had stepped through the door wearing a badge and boots. "I'd like to step out," I whispered to the agent. "Of course," she said, nodding. I left the room as more agents entered, one with a box, another with handcuffs. And I realized the air had changed. The ground had shifted. I had walked in with fear and walked out with proof. Everything after this would be different. They didn't scream. There were no shouts, no dramatic protests, no slammed fists or flying papers. That was what struck me most as I stood in the hallway, back pressed against the cool marble wall outside the conference room, how quiet it all was. It wasn't like in the movies. It was worse. It was cold, icy, methodical. The agents moved quickly, efficiently, with the kind of discipline that told me this wasn't their first time dismantling a tidy little fraud masquerading as a family. Through the narrow glass window in the office door, I saw Richard being led back toward a side room, hands behind his back, wrists now bound in shiny metal. He didn't resist. Marlene was already crying, quietly, her designer bag clutched tight to her chest as if it could shield her from consequence. Mr. Gaines sat frozen at the end of the table, his once confident hands trembling slightly. One of the agents was placing files into a box beside him, documents, computers, likely the same paperwork they'd tried to use against me. Everything they'd built, their timing, their scripts, their charm, was falling apart in real time. I watched it all like someone underwater. A soft voice pulled me back. "Miss Monroe!" I turned. The lead agent, Agent Barlow, stood beside me now, her expression gentler than I expected. "You're safe. We've confirmed the documents were forged. The title transfer was flagged by the registrar the moment the whistleblower request hit. Your aunt was smart to move quickly." I swallowed. Did they get anything from the account, the property?" Barlow shook her head. "Not a cent. The attempted transfer was pending approval. That's why we moved now before it cleared. You're clean. The house is still yours." "Still mine." The words hit me like wind. She motioned toward the hallway. "We'll need a formal statement at the field office, but it can wait. I'm assigning a financial restraining order on both parties involved just to prevent further complications." I nodded slowly. "I want to request a condition," I said, surprising myself. Her brow lifted slightly. "Go on." "I want my father released on bail," I said. "He deserves the legal process, but I want full financial restriction. No access to any shared accounts. No right to speak on behalf of the estate. Nothing that touches my name, my property, or my education." Agent Barlow studied me for a moment, then nodded. "We'll file it." When she stepped away, I stood still. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't scared. I was clear. Richard, Marlene, Mr. Gaines, they'd underestimated the daughter. They thought grief made me vulnerable. They didn't realize that grief also makes you pay attention. And I had paid attention to everything. I stayed just long enough to watch the elevator doors close behind them, one by one. Then I walked out into the stormy street, folder still in hand. And for the first time in months, I smiled. Not out of triumph, but because I knew I wasn't a victim. I was a witness. And now I was a force. 2 years later, the front steps still creak. The windows still groan in the wind. The porch light flickers when it rains. And the oak tree in the backyard still drops acorns on the roof like a child trying to get attention. Some things never change. But inside, everything is different. The wallpaper has been replaced. The basement pipes, finally fixed with no loan, no lies. The bookstore's old shelves, salvaged from storage, now line my bedroom wall, filled with textbooks and the paperbacks my mother used to read at the end of long days. There's still grief here in the corners, but it no longer runs the place. I do. My name is Clara Monroe, and last week I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance. Not law, not medicine, finance. Because I wanted to understand exactly how they almost stole everything from me, and more importantly, how to make sure it never happens to another girl like me. I started small, volunteering at campus workshops. Then I built a curriculum. Now I teach weekend seminars at the city library on personal finance and estate planning for young women, especially those coming out of guardianship or foster care. It's not glamorous, but it's powerful. There's something about showing a 19-year-old how to read a bank statement or protect her signature that makes me feel like I'm undoing something. A cycle. A silence. The same silence that nearly swallowed me. The same silence my mother had to fight through with every quiet decision she made to protect me. That library I mentioned, it's real. It sits at the corner of Harmony and St. Andrew in a building that used to be a post office. Now it bears a bronze plaque by the front doors. The Margaret Monroe Literacy Center for every girl who refused to be ignored. And above the entrance in clean lettering, silence protects nothing. I say that phrase a lot now, to students, to young mothers, to myself. Because silence didn't protect my mother, or me. It nearly cost us everything. But speaking up, documenting, confronting, drawing the line saved me. It doesn't always end that way. But mine did. Richard took a plea deal, fraud and forgery, community service, and a financial penalty that wiped out the last of his consulting empire. Marlene disappeared from the city within months. I never asked where. I never cared. I rebuilt this house from the foundation she gave me. My mother left me more than bricks and money. She left me proof that love can be smart and strategic. She left me a map, and I followed it. Now, when I walk through these rooms, when I pass her photo in the hallway or run my fingers across the spines of her books, I don't feel haunted anymore. I feel claimed. I feel whole. So if you've made it to the end of my story, I'll ask you the same thing I ask every young woman who walks into my workshop. What would you do if the people you trusted most tried to steal your voice? Would you speak? Would you stand? Because I did, and it changed everything.